Before I actually show you all my May wrap up, I just wanted to make a couple of things perfectly clear. The way that Black people are treated in this country, especially by law enforcement, is completely and totally unacceptable. If you are somehow surprised by recent events or the fact that more Black people have been killed by law enforcement, I implore you to pay attention to the news and actually read Black history. I'm honestly floored that any adults who have been paying attention to the news in the past 5 years were surprised by any of the events. If you are unaware of some of the longer history or the more recent history, I will be putting links in the description to Black creators who are either talking about these events or are recommending books that talk about these events. I may also put some news articles as well. If you're one of the people who isn't really sure of what to think, or perhaps you're apathetic about the situation, I would like to remind you, or perhaps tell you, that if you have rights, there are Black women in history for you to thank. In fact, there are queer Black women and femmes for you to thank. Black women and femmes have played crucial roles in women's history, in LGBT history, in the labor movement. If for some reason you need a reason to give a shit about other people, do it, because people like them are the reason you have rights. In the description below, I will also be putting links to petitions that you can sign and places that you can donate to help enrich the Black community and ensure that they see justice. And if you do not have an interest in rights or justice for Black people, or if you think that you personally shouldn't have to do anything and are uninterested in learning, please feel free to unsubscribe and fuck off. I have a vested interest in teaching people. I absolutely think that you should learn. That is why I promote the things that I promote. However, if you are completely unwilling and set in your ways, there's not a whole lot that I or anyone else can do for you. I think that's about all that I should say on this matter right now. If you're interested in learning about how racism is impacting current events, either in society in general or on BookTube specifically, I will also be putting links to videos by Black creators that you can view in the description box. Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what I read in May. In May, I participated in a few readathons, including the Heroes Readathon, the Asian Readathon, the Saphicathon, and the Zodiacathon. The Heroes Readathon and the Asian Readathon both lasted the whole month, but the Zodiacathon was only a weekend long and the Saphicathon was a week long. The Heroes Readathon is a little bit complex. You can learn more about what it is and why I chose my character in my TBR video, but basically for that I focused on reading LGBT books that I already own for the prompts that they put together for the Heroes Readathon. The goal of the Asian Readathon was to read Asian books for Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'll talk about the shorter readathons when I get to them, but I'm gonna go ahead and start with the books that I read towards the beginning of the month. I'll talk about the books that I finished first, and I will talk about the ones that I started or read part of towards the end. In general, this really wasn't a great reading month. If you watch all of my videos and follow me really closely on social media, you might have picked up on it a little bit. I was at a friend's house for a couple of weeks, and then this month I moved here. So that took a lot of energy on top of the emotional energy from the actual situation that made me move, on top of the world being on fire. So the first 2 weeks of this month I only read 2 books, and they were both graphic novels. The first book that I finished this month is Are You Listening by Tillie Walden. I read this for the first prompt of the Heroes Readathon, which is Call to Action. Read a book set outside the house. This was a road trip novel in which 2 acquaintances end up driving across Texas. Both of the main characters are or were neighbors. One of them is middle-aged and the other is a teenager. However, they're both queer, so they don't really know each other initially, but they do sort of learn about each other through this trip. Of course, this isn't any normal road trip. Some really strange things start to happen when they pick up a stray cat along their way. This was a very character-driven book, so you do get to learn a little bit more about each of the characters and certain issues that they're going through. This book does talk about coming out to your family, so there are certain themes like that, but it also deals with grieving and with sexual assault. I thought that it handled the issues very well, and they weren't central to everything going on. Like, those weren't the driving forces for the plot, but they were sort of the central thing on the characters' minds. I really loved this book. I've read another book by Tillie Walden, On a Sunbeam, that I absolutely adored. This is not on the same level as On a Sunbeam, but not very much is on the same level as On a Sunbeam, but I think I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. The next book that I read was Skim by Mariko Tamaki and Jillian Tamaki. This fit the Heroes Readathon prompt of Crossing the Threshold, read a coming of age or coming out story. This book also fits the first 2 prompts of the Asian Readathon, which are to read a book by an Asian author and to read a book by an Asian author with an Asian character that you can relate to. The main character of this book is queer, which is why it fits the second one. This was kind of a short book, especially for a standalone graphic novel. I did enjoy it. This is another one that's really character driven, and it was super neat to be able to see this character's life and get inside her head. It's definitely YA. You're focused on a teenager who is in the middle of dealing with a bunch of stuff from school. She deals with bullying, and she's also trying to deal with navigating friendship as people are changing. There are 2 big things that end up happening within all of this. One of her classmates' boyfriends ends up dying, which wasn't somebody directly in her life, but it still impacts her, and she also goes through a period of questioning her sexuality. I gave this book 3 or 3.5 stars. Part of it was because, you know, it was so short, and there were so many ideas that could have been explained a little bit more. For instance, one of the things that the character focuses on is her relationship with her body. There was definitely some discussion or some allusion to eating disorders, and I really would have wanted that to be explored more, especially with how it was put in there. I also think that some of the bit with the relationship sexuality stuff was left a little bit ambiguous and made me uncomfortable. Editing back here, I just wanted to put in a warning that some people might consider this next section sort of spoilery. I go into details a little bit more about what makes the relationship kind of uncomfortable to me, so if you want to skip out on those details, I will have a timestamp on the screen and in the description. I will tell you there is a teacher-student relationship in this book, which if you listen to me talk about A Blade So Black, I am really, really not into age gap anything, especially when it's mentor-mentee, so that made me just incredibly uncomfortable, and I think the fact that it was left so ambiguous with the teacher still makes me uncomfortable. I would have been more uncomfortable if things had been more obviously inappropriate, but it still left me feeling weird and gross. But overall, I thought it was pretty interesting. It was definitely an okay book, but I did kind of have high expectations for this book because I really adored Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, which is also by Mariko Tamaki. So the second half of the month is when I actually got some reading done. The Zodiacathon happened from the 16th to the 17th of May. This was kind of a mini edition of the Zodiacathon. I participated in the week-long version that they usually have earlier in the year. The theme for this weekend readathon was Chinese Zodiac, so they had a general prompt for everyone, which was to read a book by an Asian author, and then you had a more specific prompt based on the year that you were born in. And I was born in the year of the rooster, so my prompt was to read an award-winning book. I did end up only reading one book for this readathon that fit both of the prompts, and that was the first book in Persepolis. This also fits in with the Asian readathon for prompt number 3, a book with Asian representation by an Asian author who is different than you. This is a graphic memoir that details the author's experience growing up in Iran in the middle of a revolution, going through a couple of different regime changes. Now, this is the complete works. Like I said, I only read one of the books. This was actually written as 4 separate comics, and then when they were published as books, they had the first 2 comics in one book and the second 2 in the next. I just bought them all together, but I did technically read the first 2 comics or the first book. This book was really eye-opening. As an American, I don't really get a whole lot of information about history of the Middle East, certainly not recent history of the Middle East. The only perspective I've ever been given on it in schools or anything else has been just a very American perspective, which is to say not a great perspective or an accurate one whatsoever. So it was really interesting to be able to learn a little bit of history through this and to be able to see kind of through the eyes of a child, because the first half is focused on her childhood, see through the eyes of a child what it's like to be in that sort of war-torn country and how it impacts the kids, not just in terms of, like, obviously it would be traumatizing, but also the different things that are normalized for them. But I am really looking forward to reading the second part of this. This is the only book that I read this month that doesn't fit in with the Heroes Readathon, because as far as I know, it's not an LGBT book. The next chunk of books I read for the Safeathon. Conveniently enough, while the Safeathon was going on, there was also a readathon happening on Instagram. Will Marie, who is Lesba Reader on Instagram, put together the 24/7, which is a challenge to read 24 hours in 7 days. So I attempted that. I failed because things were kind of wild. I ended up having some stuff to do a couple of the days and I ended up getting sick. But I still got a lot of reading done, and my main goal going in was just to finish as many books as possible, which I think that I did considering everything. So the first book I read during the Safeathon and the 24/7 was Kase-san and Yamada, Volume 1. I have read the first 5 volumes of the Kase-san and series, and this is Volume 6. Even though it's Volume 1 of Kase-san and Yamada, this is kind of their college years. And this is basically just like a pure fluff Yuri series that follows these two girls who just love each other. It's pretty wholesome. So this covered prompt number 2 for the Safeathon, which is to read a graphic novel, and prompt number 3, which is to read a book with a trope you love. The trope being just pure fluff for fluff's sake. And this also technically could count within the Asian Readathon as well. Overall, this was a good and cute read, but I was a little bit disappointed. I think I gave it like 3.5 stars. A lot of the book did focus on a plotline that involved jealousy, and that's just not really my thing. It was still pretty cute. Lots of good moments, but not my favorite in the series. Next, I read Motor Crush, Volumes 1 and 2. Between the two of them, they covered a number of prompts. For the Heroes Readathon, it covered Return, a book by a new-to-you author. I had not read anything by this person before. And it covered Revelation, a 5-star prediction. I thought it would be a 5-star because I had heard really great things about it. Additionally, it's hot queer ladies on motorcycles. I don't know how I could have not liked it, and I really, really loved it. I do think that I gave each of them like 4.5 stars, but it's technically a Goodreads 5, so we'll say it counts. The only kind of bad thing is that I got like lost a couple of times, just with the way that some of it was formatted a little bit. But overall, it's a really good series. The plot is really interesting. I think the first volume really drew me in, so even if I hadn't gone out and already had the second volume, I probably would have gone out and tried to find it. It would have just been disappointing because I would have to wait, like I'm having to for the third volume. This has some sci-fi elements. The world is a little bit futuristic, but the main character in particular has something about her. I don't really want to say too terribly much because I don't want to give anything away, but it is a really interesting book. The next book that I'm going to talk about that I read for the Safeathon was Blue is the Warmest Color by Julie Mauro. This fit prompt number 1, which was to reread a book. I did really enjoy my reread of it. I think that I got even more out of it in terms of what it has to say about like the dangers of internalized homophobia and different things like that. But I still maintain that the first 3/4 of the book is absolutely wonderful, and the last 1/4 is way too rushed. So just for that, I would give it 4 stars instead of 5, but if the whole thing was written like the first half of the book was, it would absolutely be a 5-star read. It would probably also be at least twice as long, which I would love, but it's not the reality. The next book that I read for the Safeathon and the 24/7 was When They Call You Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir by Patrice Concolors and Asha Bandele. This book fit into the Heroes Readathon for Death and Rebirth, a book that's been on your TBR for over a year, as well as Atonement, which is a book that broadens your worldview. And then it fit into the Safeathon as a book that's been on my TBR for a long time and is written by an author of color. And I also used it for the free space, which I decided would be for a nonfiction book. For those who don't know, Patrisse Cullors is one of the 3 founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. This was such an incredible book. I listened to it on audiobook for the most part, actually, which is narrated by Patrisse Cullors. This goes through her experience growing up in a city in California during the war on drugs. And this was extremely relevant to read right before all of the protests and everything that have recently started. I didn't expect to have this book line up so well with current events, but it really did give a lot of perspective. I honestly haven't read as much about the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s. I have read a couple of books that cover that, of course, The New Jim Crow and White Rage, but having such a personal perspective and getting to see very specific instances of how this impacted her life and the people in it was just absolutely incredibly powerful. I also really love the fact that throughout the book, when she's talking about her activism, she acknowledges the role of trans and queer people within her community, her being a queer woman herself, which is why I read her in the middle of the Effervescence. I don't have enough brain power to articulate the impact of this book. I've been saying that In the Dream House is my best read of 2020, but I think this edges it out. It's just incredible on every front. The writing is beautiful. I kind of expected to be blown away by the introduction because it was Angela Davis, but throughout the whole book I got chills, especially listening to her read it, especially with everything going on right now and the fact that so many people seem to be oblivious to the fact that Black people have continually had to deal with shit. It didn't go away in the 80s or 90s. Things didn't end in 1964. Please just go out and read this book. This book is going to become a classic. So after that really heavy book, I finished the last 50 pages of The Gilda Stories by Joel Gomez. This book fit into the Effervescence with prompt number 4, which was to read a book by an author of color. This also fit in the Heroes Readathon with the prompt Trials and Errors, a book that you started and never finished. Since I started this in March and have taken so long to read it, I included it under that prompt. It has not taken me this long because of anything that actually has to do with the book. I just haven't really been able to focus on it. This book focuses on the main character, Gilda. When the story starts, she's about 12 or so, and she's a slave who has escaped the plantation that she's on. As she's going and escaping, she ends up meeting these new people who end up kind of taking her in, taking her under her wing, and some of those people happen to be vampires. Throughout the course of the book, she's turned into a vampire. And so you might have a certain idea in your head about how a vampire story is supposed to go, especially with, we had the influx of the vampire YA, but this doesn't really fit necessarily with the vampire YA tropes. Within this book, each chapter focuses on a different year, starting in 1850 and ending in 2050. There's a lot of really wonderful social commentary in this book, especially since the main character is Black, and throughout most of the book, she is living in Black neighborhoods. So there's definitely commentary about racism, but there is also a lot in there about sexism. You also see a bit in terms of sexuality, and especially towards the end of the book, there's a lot of discussion about the environment. I really liked this book. Going in, definitely know that it is a little bit older, and the way that they deal with sex and sexuality, I would say, is different from how we really deal with it and talk about it now. I would say that you definitely should try out this book, though. It's definitely a queer classic, and from a number of things that I read, this was one of the precursors or one of the first books that focused on Afrofuturism or kind of similarly themed books. After the Effervescence, I read Genderqueer, a Memoir by Maya Kobabe. This fit in the Heroes Readathon under the prompt Gift from the Gods, a book recommended to you by a booktuber. This fit that prompt because this was one of the book picks for the NB Book Club, which is on Instagram. I really liked this book. I found some of it to be particularly relatable as a non-binary person. Not all of it, just because I don't necessarily have the same relationship to my body that they do, but it was really interesting. I thought that some of the metaphors that they used to talk about how they understood their gender was really relatable. And I really enjoyed hearing about their experience, especially growing up with the sort of parents that they did, who were a little bit more loose and free spirit. So a lot of the pressure that they felt was really from their peers and outside sources. Not that their parents understood everything completely, but it was still a lot different than the typical narrative that you see. Additionally, it was really cool not only to see someone who's non-binary, but it was really neat to hear about asexuality and figuring out that part of their identity as well. So those were the books that I finished in May. There were a few that I started that I do plan on finishing at some point. The first of those was Gender Outlaw by Kate Bornstein. I started reading this for the Heroes Readathon prompt Meet Your Mentor, a book by an author that you admire. Kate Bornstein is an essential figure when you're looking at gender studies, especially in terms of the trans experience. I really enjoyed this book. I was just having a lot of problems reading and concentrating this month, which is why I finished almost exclusively graphic novels. This brings together her own personal experience with social commentary and social analysis. So I really love this book so far, and I'm looking forward to hopefully finishing it up next month, or technically this month, June, Pride Month. The next book that I started and didn't finish was Restored Selves, Autobiographies of Queer Asian Pacific American Activists. I started reading this for the Asian Readathon for prompt number 2, a book with Asian rep by an Asian author that you can relate to, because I'm queer and the people in this book are queer as well. I did think that this was really interesting, and it was good for my concentration levels because they were stories from a whole bunch of different people. So each chapter is a different person's narrative. I just did not read all of their narratives yet. I've gotten about halfway through. I'm really looking forward to finishing it. I like it so far. I just didn't get it finished. And finally, the last book that I'll be talking about that I started in the month of May was an e-arc of The Tragedy of Heterosexuality by Jane Ward. In this book, Jane Ward analyzes and basically breaks down a lot of things surrounding heterosexuality. Specifically, she looks at self-help books from the early 1900s and the sort of sexist myths that they perpetuated and kind of what those myths do. And throughout the whole book, one of her main points is that heterosexuality is actually hurting heterosexuals, especially heterosexual women. So it is a really interesting book. I agree with parts of her premise. I feel like some of it might be understating the issues that queer people deal with, especially with some of the stuff that she said towards the beginning. But like I said, I'm not done with it. I'm about 40% of the way through, so I don't really want to give final judgments, but I do think that learning about kind of early self-help books and her analysis of the cultural norms that they perpetuated is really interesting. So that is what I read in May. There are 8 whole books that were on my TBR that I did not get to, plus Moving Politics that I was supposed to finish the 3rd part of that I did not read any of. But that's what happens when you have new trauma and are in the middle of a pandemic, I guess. Hopefully next month, or this month, I'll get to read more. So far, I've only read 1 book, and it was a short poetry book, so I'm not going to hold my breath. But maybe after this, I can sit and at least finish a graphic novel. We'll see how it goes. If you all have read any of these books, definitely let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Bye.